A little girl beaten and abandoned Snowstorm. Until a billionaire's car stopped. "Get out of my sight. You worthless little brat." Her scream cut through the blizzard like glass. That night, in a mansion buried under snow, a mother's cruelty became a child's sentence. 8-year-old Lila stood trembling at the door, clutching a torn suitcase as the storm swallowed her cries. And down that same frozen road, a billionaire's car was about to stop, not by accident, but by fate. What would you have done in his place? Would you have stopped? Welcome to Emotional Echoes, a channel where emotions come alive and every story leaves a lasting echo in your heart. Please subscribe to Emotional Echoes. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so more souls can feel these stories. Stay till the very end and tell me where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story spreads. Now, let me tell you a story that begins with cruelty and ends with redemption. That night, the storm didn't just howl through the streets of Boston. It screamed like a wounded thing. Inside a grand house at the end of the lane, Melissa Carter's voice cut through the wind as if anger itself had found a body to live in. "Get out of my sight. You worthless little brat." Her words hit harder than the snow slapping against the windows. Lila stood by the door, holding a small torn suitcase, her hands trembling so badly she could barely keep her grip. "Please, Mom, I didn't mean to." Her voice was a whisper that broke halfway through the sentence. Melissa's face twisted with disgust. "I'm not your mother, and you're not my problem anymore." With one shove, she sent the child stumbling down the icy steps. The door slammed shut behind her. No light, no warmth, just the echo of a child crying in the dark. Lila sat down on the frozen path, the suitcase beside her. The handle was cracked. The corner of it had torn open, spilling a small stuffed bear into the snow. She reached for it with numb fingers and held it close to her chest. She tried knocking again, but her voice vanished into the wind. "Please, I'll be good. I'll be quiet. Please, open the door." There was only silence on the other side, a silence that felt heavier than the cold. Her breath came in small, shaky clouds. The snow hit her face like needles. She didn't even have boots, just thin socks soaked through. The world blurred, her eyes stinging from the cold. Somewhere in her chest, a thought repeated like a heartbeat. She said, "I don't belong anywhere." She said, "I don't belong anywhere." Far down the road, headlights appeared. For a moment, Lila thought she imagined them, but then a car stopped. The engine hummed, steady and low. A tall man stepped out, his coat snapping in the wind. He looked at her the way no one had in a long time. Not with pity, but with shock and something deeper. "Sweetheart, what are you doing out here alone?" Lila tried to stand, but her knees buckled. The man caught her before she fell. His coat smelled faintly of cedar and rain. "It's freezing. You'll be out here." She stared at the ground and said softly. She said, "I don't belong anywhere." The man didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, his breath visible in the air. Then he said, "She's wrong. Get in the car." She hesitated. No one had ever said those words to her before. Something in his voice made her believe him. He lifted her gently, wrapped his coat around her shoulders, and carried her to the SUV. Inside, the heat stung her skin, like waking from a bad dream. She turned her face toward the window, but the snow outside had turned to blur. For the first time in a long while, someone had stopped. Someone had seen her. As the car moved away, the house behind them disappeared into the storm. Melissa's lights flickered through the snowfall, then vanished. Lila pressed her face into the man's coat and whispered a single word. So small, it barely left her lips. "Thank you." He didn't reply. He just drove, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The silence between them, heavy but strangely safe. That night, the storm didn't stop, but for one lost child. Something else did. The endless running. The fear of being unwanted. She didn't know it yet. But that night, the night she was thrown out, was also the night she was finally found. Ethan parked in front of his Beacon Hill mansion, the kind of house that made silence echo. He carried Lila inside, her head resting against his shoulder, small and weightless, like something fragile that could break if he breathed too hard. The warmth of the foyer hit her skin, but she didn't relax. Her eyes darted around as if expecting someone to shout at her again. Mrs. Ramirez appeared from the hallway, her slippers soft against the marble floor. When she saw the child, she froze. "Oh, dear Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She's frozen half to death." Without waiting for an answer, she ran for towels and a blanket. Ethan placed Lila on the couch, kneeling beside her as Mrs. Ramirez covered her in layers of warmth. He watched as the color slowly returned to her cheeks. Mrs. Ramirez brushed the child's wet hair away from her face and muttered something in Spanish under her breath. Ethan could see the questions in her eyes, but he said nothing. The only sound in the room was the crackle of the fireplace. Mrs. Ramirez returned with a cup of cocoa. "Drink this, sweetheart. It'll warm you up." Lila looked at the cup, but didn't touch it. Ethan nodded gently. "It's okay. You're safe here." She hesitated, then took a sip. Her hands shook so hard, some of the cocoa spilled onto her sleeve. He reached out, but she flinched. He pulled his hand back. After a moment, her voice broke the silence. "Are you going to take me back?" The question hit him like a punch. "No, not tonight," he said softly. "You need to rest." She looked away, her eyes wet. "She always said no one wanted me, that my father left because he didn't want me." Ethan felt something twist deep inside. For a second, he couldn't speak. He just sat there, staring at the child in front of him. Then, almost to himself, he said, "Sometimes grown-ups lie to cover their guilt." Lila looked up, confused. He forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's not your fault." Mrs. Ramirez stood behind him, watching the two of them. She had seen Ethan like this before. The way he looked at children since the accident, as if seeing ghosts. When Lila finally fell asleep on the couch, Mrs. Ramirez pulled Ethan aside. "Sir, you shouldn't get attached." Her tone was soft but firm. "She's been through enough." He didn't look at her. "She'd have died out there if I hadn't stopped." "That's not attachment. That's humanity." Mrs. Ramirez said, her eyes glistening. "Maybe, but humanity can hurt too." He said nothing. His gaze was fixed on the sleeping child, her fingers still clutching the worn-out teddy bear like a lifeline. Later, when Mrs. Ramirez went to prepare a guest room, Ethan sat alone by the fire. He thought about what the girl had said, about a father who didn't want her. The words replayed in his mind until they tangled with his own memories. A car crash, a phone call, a little girl's laughter that vanished too soon. He rubbed his hands together, trying to shake off the chill that wasn't from the weather. In the next room, Lila stirred in her sleep, murmuring something he couldn't hear. He stood up, hesitated, then gently draped his coat over her again. He told himself it was temporary, just until the police figured things out. But somewhere deep down, he knew that nothing about this night was temporary. For the first time in 4 years, the mansion didn't feel completely empty. Something had changed. Subtle but real. Like a crack in the ice, letting in a little light. The next morning, sunlight slid through the curtains, but the house still felt heavy. Lila was upstairs asleep, curled under the same coat Ethan had placed over her the night before. He stood by the window with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The weight in his chest hadn't lifted. When Mrs. Ramirez asked what he planned to do, he said quietly, "I'll call someone who can find out the truth." He dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Miller. "It's Ethan Moore. I need a favor." His old friend, now the police chief, didn't ask for details at first. He just said, "Give me an address." A few hours later, a squad car stopped outside Melissa Carter's home in South Boston. Melissa opened the door, her face painted with surprise. Officers explained they were responding to a welfare check concerning a missing child named Lila Carter. She gasped, hand on her chest. "Oh my God." She ran away. "I was terrified all night. I called friends. I didn't sleep a minute." Her voice trembled at all the right moments, but her eyes gave nothing away. Inside, the house was spotless. Too spotless. One officer noticed a small dent in the wall near the staircase and a broken toy buried in the trash. Melissa said it was an accident. Kids get clumsy sometimes. Miller took notes, his expression calm but skeptical. When they asked for Lila's birth certificate, Melissa went pale. She fumbled through drawers, pretending to search. Then she sighed dramatically. "It must have been misplaced. We adopted her years ago. I don't remember from where exactly. Some agency handled it." She smiled, nervously, trying to shift attention. Back at the station, Miller pulled the records. There was no adoption file. No birth certificate. No school record that matched a legal identity. What they did find was a missing persons entry from Vermont. A 4-year-old girl found alone at a gas station. No ID. No memory. No relatives. The report was dated exactly 4 years ago. Miller called Ethan. The man's voice on the other end was steady but low. "Say that again." Miller repeated it, slower. This time, the girl was found in Vermont 4 years ago, near Route 87. Ethan's hand trembled. His breath caught somewhere between disbelief and fear. Vermont, Route 87. 4 years ago. It felt like time stopped. His mind refused to understand, but his heart already knew. The name, the date, the place, they all aligned like cruel clockwork. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he wasn't standing in his study anymore. He was back on that phone call, the one that shattered everything. Grace and their daughter, Emily, driving home from a weekend trip. The driver who swerved across the lane, the car that went down the embankment and caught fire before help arrived. He pressed a hand to his forehead. The numbers lined up too perfectly. The same day, the same state, a child about the same age. It couldn't be coincidence. Mrs. Ramirez entered quietly, carrying Lila's washed clothes. She froze when she saw his face. "Sir, what's wrong?" Ethan didn't answer. He was staring at the photograph on his desk, the one of Grace holding their little girl. The photo shook in his hand. He whispered more to himself than to her. 4 years ago, a car crash took them from me. But what if it didn't? The room fell silent again, filled with the hum of something invisible: fear, hope, disbelief, all blending into one. He looked toward the staircase where Lila slept. His fingers tightened around the photo until the frame cracked. Somewhere deep inside, something began to move, like a locked door creaking open. 4 years earlier, the road outside Vermont was covered in a thin layer of ice. Grace Moore had both hands tight on the wheel, her daughter Emily in the back seat, humming along to a lullaby from the radio. The snow fell softly then, the kind that made everything look peaceful. Grace smiled in the mirror at her little girl, unaware that fate had already changed lanes ahead of her. A pickup truck came out of nowhere, swerving across the yellow line. Grace gasped, jerking the wheel to avoid it. The sound of metal scraping against ice filled the night. Then came the crash. The car spun twice before slamming into the guardrail. The world turned white and red. Emily screamed for her mother. Grace reached back, her fingers trembling. "It's okay, baby. Hold on." Then the explosion came. The heat consumed everything. By the time emergency calls reached dispatch, the fire had already swallowed the car. But someone else was closer. Melissa Carter sat in another vehicle a few hundred yards away. Her husband, drunk and terrified, was bleeding from his head. He muttered that he lost control. She looked at him, then at the smoke rising from below the hill. Panic struck her like lightning. "If anyone finds out, you're finished," she said. He slurred something about prison, about losing everything. She climbed out of the car, boots slipping in the snow, heart pounding so loud it drowned out her thoughts. Down the slope, the wreck burned bright against the darkness. The flames were too strong to go near. But then she saw something, a small figure, thrown far from the crash, lying motionless in the snow. She ran to it, dropping to her knees. The child was still breathing, faintly. Her face was covered in soot, eyes closed, but alive. Melissa looked back toward her husband's truck, then down at the child again. The world spun around her. She heard sirens in the distance and knew she had no time. In a voice that didn't sound like her own, she whispered, "You were never here." She wrapped the child in her coat, lifted her, and stumbled back to the car. Her husband's voice cracked when he saw her. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "Saving you." Dumb it. From that moment, a lie was born. The child became their secret. At the hospital, Melissa told the nurse the girl was theirs, adopted from out of state. The paperwork was never checked. The story sounded clean enough for people to stop asking questions. But Lise wrote over time. At first, Melissa told herself she was doing it to protect her family. Then she told herself she was saving the child from the truth. But the longer she looked into the girl's eyes, the harder it became to breathe. The child's laughter, her blue eyes, her voice when she called her mommy, each sound carved guilt into Melissa's bones. The love she tried to fake turned into resentment, and resentment became cruelty. Every time she raised her voice, every time she slammed a door, it wasn't really at the girl. It was at the memory of that night, at the flames she could never erase. Over the years, guilt twisted into something darker, until the woman who once trembled at her husband's sin had become just like him. Now, in the present, Ethan stared at the file Miller had sent him. The photo of the lost child found in Vermont stared back. The same date, the same road, the same blue eyes. He whispered the name softly, as if afraid it might disappear. Emily. The truth hit him like the fire had hit her. Lila wasn't just a lost child. She was his. Lila sat by the window that afternoon, tracing shapes on the fogged glass. She had been quiet all day, her thoughts floating somewhere far beyond the room. Mrs. Ramirez folded laundry nearby, humming softly, when Lila suddenly asked, "Why do I dream of a yellow room?" The words made the old woman freeze. Ethan, sitting on the couch, reading, slowly lowered his book. "What did you say?" Lila frowned, as if pulling a memory from mist. It had yellow walls, and there were stars on the ceiling. There was music too. Someone was singing. She hesitated, then began to hum. The sound was small at first, uncertain. But then the melody took shape, gentle, familiar, hauntingly so. Ethan's hand went still. The book slipped from his grasp and hit the floor. The melody wrapped around him like a ghost from another life. Grace used to hum that same song every night, the tune that filled their home before the fire. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He stood up, moving closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Keep humming, sweetheart. Please." Lila looked up at him, uncertain but continued. And as she did, the world seemed to vanish. Ethan wasn't in Beacon Hill anymore. He was back in that small yellow nursery, sunlight spilling through lace curtains, his wife's laughter filling the air, their daughter spinning barefoot in her socks, clapping along to the rhythm. Then, as suddenly as it came, the vision dissolved, leaving only silence and the faint sound of Lila's breath. He turned away, pressing his hand to his mouth. "Mrs. Ramirez's voice broke through gently. That song, it means something to you, doesn't it?" Ethan nodded slowly. His voice cracked. "Grace used to sing it to our daughter before she fell asleep. Only she and I knew it. That evening, Ethan made a quiet call to Miller. "I need a DNA test. No questions. No paperwork trail. Just fast." Miller didn't argue. A few strands of Lila's hair, a signature, and the samples were sent. The days that followed were long and sleepless. Every time Ethan looked at the girl, he saw both faces: the child he lost and the one he had found. On the third night, the phone rang. Miller's voice was low, measured. "Ethan." The results came back. "It's a 99.9% match." For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. The room around him faded. Sounds disappeared. He could no longer hear the ticking clock, the hum of the heater, or the rain against the windows. All he could hear was the sound of a child's laughter echoing from years ago, that soft, high giggle that once filled his home. Then everything broke open. His knees weakened. He sat down slowly, the phone still pressed to his ear. A sound escaped him, not quite a cry, not quite a laugh, something raw, something that had waited 4 years to be released. Mrs. Ramirez appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. "What does it mean?" "Sire." Ethan looked up, tears streaming down his face, but his voice steady. "Reverent. It means she's home." He walked to Lila's room, each step heavy and trembling. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed, coloring with her pencils, unaware of the storm that had just ended. When she looked up, she smiled shyly. "Did I do something wrong again?" He shook his head, kneeling beside her. "No. Sweetheart, you did everything right." She tilted her head, curious about the tears on his cheeks. "You look like someone I saw in my dreams," she said softly. Ethan smiled through the ache. "Maybe that's because I've been dreaming of you too." When she wrapped her arms around him, the world seemed to stop once more. The years of silence, the fire, the grief, all of it dissolved into the warmth of that moment. He held her close, whispering the name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Emily. The sound of it felt like breathing again. Ethan stood outside Melissa Carter's house as the police car headlights swept across the snow. The same house where she had thrown his daughter into the storm now looked small, fragile, and afraid. His hands were clenched at his sides, but his face was calm. The kind of calm that comes only after pain has burned everything else away. Chief Miller gave a quiet nod before knocking on the door. Melissa opened it, her face tightening when she saw Ethan. For a brief second, guilt flickered behind her eyes, but she covered it with a smile that didn't reach her mouth. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Miller's voice was steady. "Mrs. Carter, we need to talk about a girl named Lila." Her hand trembled slightly on the doorknob. "I told you." She ran away. Ethan stepped forward. "No, you threw her out." Melissa's throat tightened. "That's not true. She was impossible. Always crying. Always reminding me." She stopped herself, eyes darting toward the officers. Ethan's voice cut through the air, low and shaking. "Reminding you of what?" Her composure cracked. She looked at him, tears forming but never falling. "Of that night, of everything I tried to forget." Ethan took a slow breath. His voice softened, but the words still hit like knives. "You didn't forget. You punished her because she reminded you of your sin." Melissa's eyes widened, and for a moment, the mask fell away. "You think I wanted this? You think I planned it? My husband drove drunk. He killed your wife. He ruined our lives. And then I saw that child lying there, barely breathing. And I thought if I could save her, maybe God would forgive us." "You didn't save her," Ethan said quietly. "You stole her." Her voice broke. "I gave her food, a home, a family. What did you want me to do? Hand her over and let my husband rot in prison?" Ethan's restraint finally cracked. His voice rose, sharp with grief. "You looked into her eyes every day and chose to lie. You let her grow up, believing she was nothing." Melissa shook her head. "Despérate now. You don't understand." Every time she smiled, I saw what I destroyed. Her voice collapsed into a whisper. "I couldn't love her without hating myself." Ethan's eyes glistened, but his tone stayed steady. "So you made her pay for your guilt. You called that saving her." She looked down, tears falling now, hitting the floor like drops of ash. Miller stepped forward, handcuffs in hand. "Mrs. Carter, you're under arrest for concealment of identity and obstruction." Melissa didn't resist. She just stared at Ethan. Her voice was small, hollow. "I used to dream she'd forgive me someday." Ethan's reply was quiet. "Maybe she will, but I won't." The click of the handcuffs echoed through the hall. As the officers led her out, Lila appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide and wet. She had been listening the whole time. Her voice shook as she looked at Ethan. "Is it true? Was she talking about me?" He froze, every muscle in his body trembling. Lila took a step closer, her small hands balled into fists. "Am I your daughter?" Ethan dropped to one knee, his breath catching. For a second, he couldn't speak. Then he reached out, his voice breaking. "You've always been mine." Lila threw herself into his arms. He held her as if afraid she might disappear again. The child's sobs filled the quiet house. Mixing with the sound of police radios outside, Ethan closed his eyes, pressing his face into her hair, whispering again and again, "You're home now. You're home." Outside, the police car doors shut, taking Melissa away. Inside, the storm that had begun 4 years ago finally began to fade. The days after Melissa's arrest felt quiet in a way Ethan had never known. The chaos was gone, but so was the noise that used to fill the silence inside him. Lila followed him around the house like a shadow, not out of fear, but out of something gentler, something that had no name yet. Every now and then, she would stop and ask small questions, as if trying to rebuild the missing pieces of her story. One morning, she touched a piano key in the living room and looked up at him. "This sound feels familiar," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Your mum loved this piano. You used to dance around it while she played." Lila pressed another key, and a faint memory flickered behind her eyes. "I remember her perfume. It smelled like flowers and rain." Her voice trembled, and she turned to him, searching his face as if to be sure it was safe to remember. "Mrs." Ramirez watched from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She didn't speak, but her eyes softened. She had seen grief break Ethan before. But this was different. This was grief turning back into life. That night, when Lila went to bed, Ethan sat by her side and tucked her in. He hesitated for a moment, then whispered. Grace used to hum that same lullaby before she slept. Lila smiled, with her eyes half closed. Maybe that's why it feels like home. The next morning, Ethan told her they were going somewhere important. They drove quietly out of the city until the skyline disappeared behind them. The road curved through bare trees and winter air. When they reached the small cemetery, the wind was still, as if the world had paused to let them breathe. Ethan held Lila's hand as they walked between the stones. They stopped at the headstone that read Grace Moore, beloved wife and mother. Lila's grip tightened around his fingers. For a long time, she just stood there, her eyes moving over the carved letters like she was reading her own reflection. Then she took the small teddy bear she had carried everywhere and placed it at the base of the grave. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Mommy, I'm home." Ethan's chest ached as he knelt beside her. He didn't cry this time. There was no need. The tears that had once meant loss now meant something closer to peace. He placed his hand on the stone, his voice calm and low. "She never stopped loving you, Emily, and neither did I." Lila leaned her head on his shoulder. The air between them filled with something sacred and quiet. Mrs. Ramirez had come with them but stayed back by the car. Watching the two figures framed against the grey sky, her hands were clasped together, not in sorrow but in gratitude. She whispered to herself, "Sometimes God breaks people just enough so they can feel love again." She wiped her eyes and smiled faintly. On the drive home, Lila hummed the same lullaby under her breath. Ethan didn't say anything. He just listened, one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting lightly on hers. The melody filled the car, and for the first time in years, the silence between them was not empty. It was healing. When they reached home, Lila ran ahead and sat by the piano again. Her fingers pressed the same keys she had touched that morning. Ethan joined her, his voice low but steady. "Play it again." "Sweetheart." She nodded and began to play, her small hands finding the right notes one by one. The music was simple, imperfect, but it carried something bigger than either of them. That night, as Ethan turned off the lights, he glanced at her room one last time. The teddy bear she had left at the grave was gone from her arms, but her face was peaceful. He whispered a quiet good night, closed the door, and for the first time in 4 long years, he believed the world was beginning to heal. The courtroom was so quiet that even the faint buzz of the ceiling lights sounded loud. Ethan sat in the second row, his posture calm, his eyes distant. Across the aisle, Melissa Carter sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly, her shoulders trembling. Her once perfect poise was gone. The weight of what she had done had finally settled over her like a shadow she couldn't shake. The prosecutor laid out the evidence, the DNA, results, the missing persons report from Vermont, photos of a little girl with eyes too bright for the pain she had endured. Each fact landed like a stone in the silence. Ethan didn't look at the screens. He didn't need to. Every image was already burned into his memory. When the judge asked if Melissa wanted to speak, she stood slowly, gripping the wooden edge of the table. Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away. "I thought I was fixing what my husband broke," she said softly. "He killed your wife. He destroyed everything that was good in us. I thought if I saved her, maybe I could make it right." Her words trembled. "But I didn't save her. I hurt her. Every time she called me Mom, I heard what I'd stolen. Every time she smiled, I saw what I destroyed." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. But Ethan didn't move. He just watched her, his face unreadable. Then the judge turned to him. "Mr. Moore, would you like to say anything?" Ethan rose. His voice was low, but it carried through the room like something meant to last. "There's nothing I can say that will undo what's been done," he began. "The truth is, if punishment could bring back what I lost, I'd ask for it. But all it ever did was make me smaller." He paused, his gaze steady on Melissa. "The only way to pay for evil is to stop passing it on, to stop turning pain into more pain." Melissa's face crumpled, tears spilling over. She tried to speak but couldn't. Ethan continued, softer now. "I don't forgive what happened, but I can't live the rest of my life letting it poison what's left. My daughter deserves a world that doesn't keep burning." The judge leaned forward, tapping his pen once. "Mrs. Carter, the court finds you guilty of concealment and obstruction. However, based on psychological evaluation and your cooperation, this court believes punishment alone won't heal what's broken. Your sentence will include mandatory therapy, rehabilitation, and service in child protection programs under supervision." Gasps and whispers spread through the courtroom. Melissa covered her face and began to sob. Ethan lowered his head, a long, shaking breath leaving him. For the first time in years, his shoulders seemed lighter, his expression unguarded. Justice had been served, but mercy had made it whole. Outside, reporters crowded the courthouse steps, their voices sharp against the cold wind. Ethan ignored them. He walked down the stairs where Mrs. Ramirez waited with Lila. The girl was holding a paper flower she'd folded while waiting. When she saw him, she ran forward and took his hand. Did they forgive her? "Daddy." He looked down at her, eyes soft. "Not yet, sweetheart. But maybe someday." Lila smiled a little, as if that was enough. They walked away together, hand in hand, as church bells began to ring in the distance. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel haunted by loss. He felt whole, not because the past had vanished, but because he had finally stopped letting it define him, and as Lila hummed the old lullaby beside him, he knew that forgiveness wasn't about erasing pain. It was about learning to live gently with it. 1 year later, winter returned to Boston, but it felt different this time. The snow outside fell softly against the windows, and inside the Beacon Hill home, the air was warm, filled with the sound of a piano. Ethan sat beside Lila on the bench, his hands moving slowly across the keys while hers followed along. Smaller, lighter, but confident, the same melody echoed through the house. The one Grace used to play, the lullaby that had survived fire, loss, and time. Lila laughed when she hit the wrong note, and Ethan smiled, shaking his head. Close enough, he said quietly. She grinned and tried again, the sound blending into something sweet and imperfect, like the way life had become. The golden light from the window touched her face, and Ethan found himself watching her, amazed at how much she had grown, how her laughter had filled every corner of a house that once felt like a tomb. After the song ended, Lila leaned against his arm. "Daddy, can bad people ever change?" Her voice was small but curious, the kind of question that didn't ask for judgment, only understanding. Ethan looked at the piano keys for a long time before answering. Maybe, if someone gives them a reason to. Lila thought about that, her brows furrowing. Like we did with her, Ethan nodded slowly. Exactly like that. For a moment, neither spoke. The snow outside kept falling, covering the city in white. The piano stood silent between them. But the quiet felt peaceful now, not empty. Lila slid off the bench and ran toward the door, slipping her boots on clumsily. Ethan followed her to the porch. The cold air rushed in, sharp and clean. Lila stepped out into the yard, her arms outstretched, face turned toward the sky. Tiny snowflakes landed on her eyelashes, melting as soon as they touched her skin. She turned and smiled. "It's not so cold anymore." Ethan stood in the doorway, his heart full. Watching her dance under the falling snow felt like seeing Grace again. Not in body, but in spirit, living through the child they had both loved. He whispered softly, half to himself, half to the memory that never really left. Sometimes love doesn't come to us in sunlight. Sometimes it finds us in the storm, when someone chooses to stop, open the door, and bring us home. The piano tune played again faintly behind them, the house no longer hollow but alive. Snow fell harder, but inside that small world, there was only warmth. From a stormy night, when a child was thrown into the snow, to the day she played piano beside the father, she'd forgotten this story. Reminds us that love can find its way even through fire and loss. Compassion can heal what punishment never could. And sometimes, family isn't about blood, but about who chooses to stay. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe, like, and share emotional echoes so more hearts can feel these stories. Thanks for listening and for feeling this one with us.